Like any good, even slightly alternative millennial cusper, I watched Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and enjoyed the out of it. Even though I'm not really fully in its demographic, I have never played a Zelda game, and I wouldn't have known the patch on his jacket was for X-Men if you hadn't told me, and I'm sure tons of other references went right over my head. But it was still crafted with that out-of-the-box style that punches you in the face with moments to geek out about, from editing that was meant to be noticed against the norm to these striking visual aspects crafted well before the cutting room floor just the same. And at the end of the day, those references I missed and those film things I geeked out on are both playing the same role of adding emphasis to what really stood out to me. That very specific feeling about life that the movie gives you, one that's hard to really put into words. The most I could say is that after rewatching the movie, I found my time just sitting at home trying to relax unsatisfying. I found myself planning what I could do next time I was with someone else instead. I wanted to go out and find something indicative of my own worth in the way that Scott does in the movie, somehow turning a meh date with an interesting person like Ramona into a night to remember in those very low-key ways, like the, well, how about we just get under it on your bed quote, or how they sit on his floor and eat garlic bread with some probably awful cheap wine. The feeling the movie exudes in their early meetings is ideally unideal. The idea that's born in most people my age, probably from our adult years being defined by fighting an ever-crushing and theft-crazy upper class, and so we have to make do with cheap dates. We have to be able to build a connection from the emotions we put into simple actions rather than grand or expensive gestures. But these two have brings me right back to college, where dates were like a box of mac and cheese and whatever show we were both obsessed with at the time. To me at least, the way it nails that feeling is what really makes the movie special, and why it left me somewhat unsatisfied with my own recent adventures to meeting people. I'd never gotten to those kind of moments with anyone for maybe a year or so. But those aspects get crushed under the more high-key action that follows, where Scott goes from zero to hero because it, uh, he plays bass well. He turns into a badass who fights off powerful people not from any of his own actions, but because this is supposed to be a ridiculous movie that does better leaving things jokingly unexplained. He fights well because the writer said that would be cool, and when we saw it, we appropriately thought, that's so cool. Before we move any further though, I'm not saying the movie is bad or unhealthy per se when I talk about all this stuff. It's fun because it was trying to be fun. I'm simply gauging how it felt with me now over 10 years after its release. But I did find that this random nature, this unexplained nature, actually makes it a bit harder for the movie to properly capitalize on those feelings the first act drew out of me, because Scott and Ramona's issues arise in these ridiculous times where they take a backseat to unexplained action. Ramona tends to be flighty and disappears, and Scott turns into Captain overly past shame about the whole 7 evil exes situation. At whirlwind pace, they meet, she disappears, comes back, Scott's get angry at having to fight for her, she goes back to Gideon from literal mind control, and somehow in there they each learn a lesson. Scott apologizes to Ramona after basing his feelings out on stage against her least developed exes, saying that he can forget about her past like she has already done with his own red flag exes. They've both done awful things to people and show the same signs now, but things can be different because at the end they come together and decide that the past doesn't have to define their future. Their mistakes in no way state what will happen next. Why I'm not really feeling that the movie is unhealthy per se is because at the end of the day it's just two flawed people trying out a relationship which has already shown some of its flaws, but they wanted to try anyway, which is of course fair. But there is one misstep I find in the rushed self-improvement of the original when Scott takes his second try at defeating Gideon, and the line, "Scott earned the power of love," changes to "Scott earned the power of self-respect," seemingly brought on by Ramona's line to him in his death dream that maybe I'm not the one you should be fighting for as she skates by. Because I don't think that Scott's issue was self-respect or not fighting for himself. Or at least that's not the full picture, and the progression of the movie in no way taught him this lesson. It may arise from some lack of self-love, Scott's issues, but he is mostly enveloped in his own pleasure. Exhibit A, Knives Chow, a situation which, as is so famously described,
Scott Pilgrim was dating a high schooler.
Everyone remembers this line in its comical delivery and how he cheats on her with Ramona, and from that we know that Scott is kind of a POS, but I forgot just how bad it is. Remember when he and Knives are playing the dance arcade game, and as she's trying to have a meaningful moment, he's motioning for her, a high schooler, to pay for the continue? Or how twice in a row he completely forgets he agreed to meet her somewhere? And also how quickly after the breakup he turns from, oh man, I feel awful, to, but now I get to sleep with a hot alternative girl. The thing is, Scott was just looking for something to make him feel good. Knives is the kind of impressionable person who can make anyone, even a chronically freeloading bassist like Scott, feel special because to her everything is cool and exciting. She's 17. Her mind is blown just from hearing him play one song at band practice, and she will literally scream her heart out at their shows in support. She makes him feel like a bigger man than he is. But the thing is, if it's just an outlet for pleasure, once he finds another outlet for that, you'll drop it instantly as he does, because now he doesn't need her almost comical levels of excitement to feel special. He has something different, the attention of a kind of person who everyone wants, and that must feel even more special. Enter Exhibit B, Ramona Flowers. I also forgot just how forceful Scott is in the movie with her. He holds her job hostage to force a date with her after stalking her at a party, and he only fights her evil exes because he's excited about making out with her. They have an exchange on the bus confirming that if he's fighting them, that means they're dating, which means to his excitement, they can make out. That's the first question he asks is, does that mean we can make out? That's why he started this, and that's why he can turn into an ass so easily when it gets hard. It's about pleasure. So of course he ends up turning into the, well, who haven't you slept with at this party guy? Because if she's been with everyone, is her attention really making him feel special? The issue is kind of his self-respect. If he understood his own feelings, then maybe he wouldn't be using people to feel like this. But you can do that without being a huge dick to them all. It doesn't fully explain why everything is a pleasure outlet for him and how he throws it all away once it's not. He's also not respecting other people, even if maybe deep down he's not respecting himself. Despite the line about self-respect, at no point do either of them actually learn about their own feelings deep down enough to change. Even as they commit to each other despite all their flaws, they're exhibiting them a lot. I mean, Ramona was about to run away and start anew again like she always did, which is right after the idea of Scott having to fight himself is immediately played off for an admittedly funny joke with Nega Scott. He literally makes friends with who he is instead of having to fight against or understand his own issues. There may be a self-improvement line in there, but it doesn't actually have much of anything behind it. They didn't learn from the past, they quite literally killed it. Yes, that means they might be able to move on now, but it doesn't mean that things will actually be different. If you just throw all the baggage away, you lose a lot of the important stuff, even if you ditch the heavy ones. Take it from a two-date disappearer, just saying the issue isn't enough to prevent it from happening again. Even being depressed by the issue each time isn't enough. You have to actually take time and work on the root of them. Understand the past they arise from. And so I never really come away from the movie thinking they'll be happy together. It seems that at least a few other people felt the same way, as seen in the new Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Now, I am about to spoil the entire plot twist in about 10 seconds, so I'd really recommend clicking off this video now if you want to avoid missing out on the best experience for the new series. But at the end of episode 1, we see a divergence. Almost everything has looked the same up until now. Scott is dating Knives, he meets Ramona, has a date with Ramona, invites her to the show, avoids juggling two girls' disaster by performing, Matthew Patel breaks in to start the fight, and then Matthew Patel kills Scott. Wait, what? The anime is a second timeline, one which diverges from the movie at that moment, after performing a bit of subtle rehab on Scott's character, like removing the stalking scene at the party, having him just actually ask her out instead of holding her half hostage, and making him the one to deny sex before Ramona does. But the twist has a twist, as Scott isn't actually dead, he's just been kidnapped. And then the twist's twist has a twist. It's 14 years in the future Scott who's actually kidnapped him to prevent him from ever dating Ramona. This Scott comes from the movie timeline where he defeats the evil exes, and he and Ramona get married and do live happily for a time, but split years later after what future Ramona describes as one rough patch. Future Scott gets argumentative when present Scott says the solution should be to tell him what he did wrong so he can fix it, and the former begins claiming that he's not the one to blame, Ramona is. He says that he was a good husband, he made the spaghetti, he didn't do anything wrong. He's very childish all this time later, shown best in that he's back to living off of Wallace, literally with all of the same furniture that wasn't his 14 years earlier, bragging about his going nowhere band with no other prospects. This Scott is the exact kind of person who would date knives to feel like a bigger person. In 14 years, he hasn't changed at all. If anything, the events of the movie might have actually made him worse. And the methods that he uses to try and make himself feel better now, very unhealthy ones, are ones he learned directly from the movie's timeline. Seeing that present Scott won't take his advice and break off from Ramona, he decides to lock himself away for 10 whole years and train to fight himself, or maybe even the entire world if he has to, all to destroy the past. He returns in the climax as the true evilest ex, fulfilling what Ramona said years earlier when they were fighting, when she said,
Just another evil ex waiting to happen.
Of course, this is what he would do, because what else did Scott learn to do? What they gathered from how they got to be together in the movie was that the past was something to be destroyed so it doesn't define their future. In their case, literally fought to death. They didn't go through the baggage, they turned it into a bonfire. It's not something inherently unhealthy. Again, don't carry that baggage forever, but it stopped short of what else they should have done in the process of throwing away the bad stuff. Because they killed it, they didn't learn from it. It showed them how to end up together, but not how to stay together. Future Ramona fares a lot better than future Scott, feeling much more mature, but then that always appeared to be the case in many ways. She seems to be the one who initiated their split, saying later to Scott that she just needed some space. Scott is for sure the one I would say is the asshole in this situation. He's acting like a petulant child over the entire situation, attempting to remove a past that was at one point happy, which means erasing someone else's joy just the same. Ramona, in contrast, tries to preserve the past, turning a book about Ramona and Scott written by young Neil into a screenplay because she knows past Scott wouldn't read a book, so that past Scott would still see their story even if future Scott convinced him Ramona was bad news. She's at least trying to make sure the memories remain. But she's not trying to save it either. She's accustomed to letting it die, to running, like she was about to do right at the end of the movie. She's okay with letting what they have turn into memories when Scott reacts poorly to her needing space. She'll leave a message for the past, but not for the present. And when she meets her former self, the advice she gives is that she should leave Scott, another ex on the pile of failed relationships, another bag to carry after destroying the old ones, just forming a new chain behind her. She has much more reason to call for this split than Scott, as he proved himself awful, but it shows that there was still more to learn from the past that she didn't. She's still too comfortable letting the present fall away to skate on to somewhere and something new. Even if more mature, she didn't learn much from their fights either. Neither of them actually learned from the past. They gained some resistance to their faults because they aired them, they stated what could go wrong and wanted to prevent it from happening, but they never actually understood why it happened enough to truly prevent it. The same faults that plagued them rear their heads again, and each ends up exactly where they began some 24 years earlier, living off of Wallace or running deliveries to come home to a crappy apartment. We got a sort of answer to the original. Things did work out, but it stopped short, only kind of worked out. There was much more to be done, and so naturally the anime seems to pick up that work. The first step it takes in this goal is actually making Scott seem completely worthless in a much more sympathetic way than the movie. There is a bit of time between it seeming like Matthew actually defeated him and Ramona uncovering that he's actually alive, and so Scott Pilgrim gets a funeral. which is crashed by Envy Adams, who performs live music at the funeral, and then when she leaves, everyone chases after her, even the people who cared about Scott. The entire thing is so jokingly casual, like young Neil saying, "Oh, you're the one who killed Scott, that's cool," and with no one really caring too much that he's gone, and even if they did, giving it up pretty easily. Even Knives, who was ready to say the L word, rushed out to chase after Envy. And then, even once he's found to be alive, most people's reaction is to say to Ramona, "Why are you trying to find him? You spent one kind of okay night together." In short, it would have been really easy to just let it all be one kind of fond memory of a guy who was a bit different from her exes, since she never saw his worst side yet this time. That's probably why she does chase him down. Without ever turning into an ass, you can actually see why she might have really liked him. There was something different in Scott, something she finds worth dedicating a bit of herself to rather than running away. We'll get back to what exactly that is a bit later. For now, we'll have to look at that method of dedication. Following the movie's lead, it seems like it's about to be fighting off the exes. As Ramona begins to track down who might have kidnapped Scott, she first comes to his exes, specifically, or most accessibly, Kim Pine. Her and Scott had a messy breakup, and so maybe she wanted some sort of revenge on him. But what she finds instead, after hearing about their past, is her own past. Roxy shows up to fight instead. What ensues is pretty directly meant to be more impactful than the movie version. There, Roxy was just a joke so they could set up the admittedly banger line,
I was just a little bi-curious. I'm a little bi-curious!
in response to Ramona saying that Roxy was nothing more than a bit of messing around experimentation to her. I mean, in the movie, she literally says it meant nothing. But in the anime, the issue is that Ramona acted as if it was meaningless when it was anything but, as if this new adaptation was simply digging deeper into the same exact interactions as the one before it, adding layers to an unexplored past. The situation seems to be that they were college roommates whose proximity led to a bit more, from experimentation to a few truly impactful nights in each other's care. However, when Ramona moved out, all she could muster to a distraught Roxy was, well, a crappy wave. Like, the kind of thing you'd give to a roommate you were cool with. Like, you could ask for a pack of their ramen and they'd never really care. You might even just be like, take it. But, like, anything in the fridge was off limits. Like, you might, if you saw them out in the world 5 years later, catch up for, like, 5 minutes. But you like, wouldn't actually stay in contact or, like, do something after that. Yeah, like, that kind of level of wave. Understandably, Roxy felt a bit snubbed by this, saying that the whole thing made her feel like nothing. Which, of course, it did, because that's what she was treated like. So, against Ramona's will, they fight instead of talking, with their blows through famous movie scenes eventually coming to an apology from Ramona.
Roxy, I'm sorry for leaving the way I did.
Treating it like nothing was a shield to herself. Much like Scott did to Knives in the movie, she didn't want to have that uncomfortable moment where she admitted that someone else's love wasn't much to her at all. But this apology does more, as when the fight against each other turns to a fight for survival, Ramona risks herself to save Roxy, ending it on a note of togetherness rather than combat. It looked like a fight, complete with a ridiculous style akin to the movie, but it became something more. Understanding. Rather than fighting her ex and just making the problem go away, she learns from them, learns from the problem. In saving and becoming friends with Roxy instead of turning her into a pile of coins, she commits to actually fixing the issue, not just stating it, literally repairing a relationship. She found that she was awful, but that she could work on part of it. Facing someone didn't have to be as bad as she thought, and doing it right now would prevent a lot of future hurt. The apology was easily accepted even after all this fighting, because that's all she needed to do. You can't force your emotions to make something of what you don't feel, but you can and should always state that fact and move forward, which they can both do now. Watching movies as pals and not killing each other as enemies. What helps Roxy move forward is that she sees that Ramona's love wasn't needed to make her feel valid. There was more, a lot more to find and experiment with in life. Being hung up on the past was doing nothing good. But her exes still coming after her gave Ramona the idea that maybe some of them took Scott, and so we move on to the best chest in the business, Lucas Lee, who's starring as Scott in the movie about the original movie. With him, the formula shifts just a bit more. This time, they don't even start with fighting each other and ending it as friends, they actually start by fighting together. Lucas starts dating the actor playing Knives, who's not 17 but is playing someone who is, and so it's made into a big paparazzi deal that crumbles his already flaking career, making him like a show that's been taken off the air. If only there was a word for that. Ramona helps him escape from the paparazzi rush that follows, and in his worst moments here, where he's gone from having everything to having nothing, we flash back to the last time he felt like that, which was when Ramona left him. He gets much more of a backstory than being a snot-nosed brat who followed her around, as this time he was an amateur skater who she provided some validation to and attention and care. She'd watch him skate, and when he fell, she'd help patch up his wounds. At least until she seemingly surprise dumped him by dating Todd right in front of his eyes. Speaking on what he felt in the present day, he says,
"That was the day I decided who I was going to be. The biggest star. That day made me who I am."
He even goes on to thank her because that awful feeling she left him with was what motivated him to live his lavish star lifestyle. She actually did come to define his entire life in a way that made him a successful, if not terrible person. Once again, what to her was meaningless meant the world to the other person. But this time there isn't an apology, and there really didn't need to be. After all, we saw who it ended up benefiting, and even more, what's really important isn't really if she can say sorry or not, she already proved that, but if she can learn from the past this go around. And she does. In Lucas's worst moment, she picks him up once again like all those years prior. He might be a loser that no one cares about again, but that doesn't impact how she might view him. She sees people a little bit differently, providing the exact kind of validation Lucas was looking for all those years earlier. She can help people with that feeling, as long as she doesn't abuse it to make herself feel better at the same time. But Lucas also found that he could provide that on his own. He didn't need Ramona to have the attention he craved, and if he did it once, he could probably do it again. Rather than obsess over her anymore, he walks off on his own, content to find a new way to, well, basically show off, which he kind of does at the end. Lucas actually kind of goes against what the original seemed to say, as the baggage he was holding actually kind of helped propel him to new heights no one could have imagined. And I think that's kind of the point. If we just kill the past when it rears its head, we'll miss that sometimes what was once awful for us, within reason, can actually be what we needed to learn about ourselves, to push us to who we wanted to be. Like with Roxy, they end as friends, understanding their time together rather than killing it. And as he's treated like a TV show that's got taken off the air, of course there needs to be a new actor to play Scott Pilgrim in the Scott Pilgrim movie contained within the Scott Pilgrim anime, which is the alternative timeline of the Scott Pilgrim movie. But we don't actually see much of him and Ramona because, well, he's busy having a gay panic with Wallace, who's simply using him for sex. A lot of sex. The twins hardly even show up at all, although we actually see some kind of detail for their backstory this time, and Gideon was fought off by a newly confident Matthew Patel who took over his empire, effectively neutralizing any input he would have on the story. This time, not everyone is actually obsessed with Ramona. Some of the past didn't really even need to be fought because they truly didn't mean anything. But from the ones that did, what we found was people who were looking for a sort of validation. There was something about being with her that satisfied something within them, from literal and figurative warmth to attention to devious control to proving that the only non-white, non-jock boy in school could be a star. Deep down, within every search for the others, there is somewhat of a search for the self. I think this is pretty present in Ramona. In almost every flashback to the exes, we see a different style defining her. At first, she's clearly in a rebellious phase, smoking at a young age, which we don't see her do later, and going against the norm in general. A bit later, she's still alternative, but also doesn't seem to mind being in with some powerful or popular people like Todd. Even further on, she actually seems to change entirely, appearing much more, in quotes, normal in her college years, like anyone new to higher education, which then shifts back to a more alternative style in the present day. There's very little consistency to herself over these exes. They might have all very well fallen in love with a different Ramona, if they even did at all. Sometimes with situations like the twins, it was just use and be used, a group of people toying with others to feel some kind of validation for whichever traits they wanted to be defined around. And that's what this all is, a search for those traits, a search for the self. Ramona is running away because in all of these people, she's finding different parts of herself, but never liking all the results. She finds a bit of validation in one way, but then something against it in others, or she finds something that seems like a better way to achieve it in someone else and so leaves them behind. Uncomfortable in one way or another, she leaves things behind to start anew with no consistency to who she is. It's using people to search for herself. Since her value isn't coming from inside, it's forced out of these people she dates. Facing them would mean facing herself, something she doesn't want to do, and so she doesn't. She runs. This is made much more obvious with her hair color changes being deliberate this time around rather than a joke for Scott to freak out over. We see the process, obviously still cut down, but with the actual steps and an indication of how much effort it would actually take to change hair colors every other week and a half. It's kind of done on an impulsive whim, but that impulsive whim leads to a whole night at home just to perform that act. After each one, she wipes off the mirror to get a look at herself, and what do we see? A surprised, dissatisfied look. She's never happy with what she finds in the mirror. This is why the original spoke about self-improvement. When you're thrashing about to find yourself, you are going to hurt other people. The only way this is solved is understanding herself. And I think the fights against her exes this time around, who begin to see the past for what it really meant to them, helps her understand this herself. What she has to do to have a fighting chance with this new possible happiness she found in Scott is first finding a love for herself, understanding from these past relationships what she was really looking for and that it was probably her. I think this is part of what draws her to Scott. He is, in fact, a loser, but he's also a genuine person in being a loser, the kind of person you can be yourself comfortably around because he's sure as hell not hiding away to seem cool. We see this with the depth that was added to he and Kim's relationship. She's a very, well, whatever attitude person, believing the worst, like that the sex bombs really do suck. Nothing really gets past that stoic front, except for in the past, Scott did. When they were younger and dated, he broke that front down by being so genuine about kind of sucking. Drawing awful sheep and saying that they were actually the best, he was able to draw out the best in someone else. She didn't have to be afraid of being genuine with him. It's a side we don't see her show to anyone else. And that's the kind of thing Scott can do, despite all his faults, and likely a reason why Ramona was drawn to him, even if it might not be something we'd understand of ourselves on the spot. That what we really like in someone else is sometimes what they allow us to show of ourselves. And so she dedicates herself to this feeling, chasing down a Scott who never had a chance to be an asshole to her. The whole time, she's not running and not fighting either, but understanding, going through whatever she has to find Scott and herself, from tracking down exes and combing over their past, to dealing with the malicious demands of Scott's ex-envy at the same time. She goes through a little bit of hell on this search, and the first bits of proof that this time things could be different. Things got tough, and she kept pushing. And it does lead her back to him and herself. We jump back ahead to the climax, where future Scott and future Ramona have both shown up and tried to warn themselves off of, well, themselves. What Ramona does to save the day against evil Scott isn't fighting him or present Scott or even herself, but choosing the thing she was looking for the whole time, herself. She merges with her own self years from now, stating that,
"The me who left him and the me who just met him, we're the same."
Going on to add that it's all the same and it's all beautiful. This is pretty much the opposite of what she did before in leaving all of her exes behind, not so subtly brought up with a flashback to them all as she makes this decision. In jumping between people like that, she was never finding a constant self, never accepting herself. It was parts she liked and parts she didn't, but both were left behind, scattered in each new person and each new life. And the search will never end that way. We're always going to find the parts we don't like with the ones we do. But if we come to understand them, see what they really are, then we can work on them with that consistency we find and become someone better from that. Life is a game of trade-offs. Our past mistakes won't define our future, but they will have to be a part of us that we use to grow. Without understanding that, we can't grow. The past can simply be killed to open a future because then that future has no basis to stand on. Those past selves will all be us and all be beautiful in who we become. And in the end, having achieved this and found herself able to say what she needs to Scott and save the day, Ramona can finally wipe that mirror clean to a smile, to a self that's so familiar, still very much like the last one she's seen, with the knowledge and ability to try and make it a one she likes, a new life of friends and opportunity. The movie is answered. Don't just throw away the past, at least understand it first. The former isn't a death sentence, but the latter helps a lot. And what about Scotty Boy in all of this? Well, while Ramona was dealing with her past self to accept the future one, Scott is seeing his future self to learn what his past one was. To be honest, that's really all the role he gets is observer, being able to witness himself and the others from a new perspective. He doesn't really get the kind of aha moment that Ramona does because this isn't his story, even if his name is on it. He sees his future self, and his future self is a dick. And he sees his even more future self, and he sees that even more future self is even more of a dick. And that's mostly because he didn't learn how to deal with anything from the movie. The best thing we can say is that he gets this time around to not fight the evil exes, instead having to watch from the sidelines, where he sees that Ramona's dedication from everything the twins robot records, where he sees himself be so horrible and the doubt it instills in the situation when Ramona says,
He's you. Do I want to date that guy?
You think I want to become that guy? I won't.
How can you be sure?
what he gets this time is to doubt himself in seeing that he's an awful person. We don't know if he'll become the kind of person he needs to be from this. But we see that this time he does at least have to confront himself in something more than a joke. His fight may just be beginning. He's fighting against the kind of person he could easily become with all the reason in the world to not become that. And anyone has the potential to become the most evil ex, but the only way we'll know is by trying. The energy of two people will always lead somewhere. The most we can do is try our best to guide it where we desire. And the only way to do that is to know yourself, who you were, and what you desire, and who that could lead you to be alike. Only with all this in mind, with us in mind and understood, not discarded or fought off, can we do our best. It's not just saying, I don't want to use people again, or I don't want to be that guy. It's understanding why we use people, and understanding why we could become that guy. And I think that's where we have to end. To be honest, you're only hearing about 11 of some 30 pages I wrote between different outlines and scripts and other different things on this series. It was one of those tough topics where it felt like it was battling inconsistencies and my own maybe lack of understanding alike at the same time. It's really hard to give Scott a proper section, for example, because the anime changes the worst aspects of his character before the timeline split. And so does future Scott come from the movie or from the anime? It really changes what I'd say about him, and it's impossible to say. It's also a series which, even if it's meant to be more meaningful now, is at the end of the day a silly romp full of unexplained, ridiculous moments, and that's the enjoyable brand that it's built. It's not a series really meant for analysis. And then on top of that, I'm really not at a point to properly express what I think it needs from someone discussing it. There is a script sitting around where I realized after watching this that my own conclusions in past videos about myself were incomplete, that maybe I didn't want to be around someone like Ramona. Maybe I wanted to be someone like Ramona. But then I know she's not having a healthy life, so what really deep down is in that desire? Is something unhealthy hidden underneath the layers, or am I just romanticizing something awful? Or something healthy hidden under the layers, or unhealthy? I don't know. Do I just want people to look at me like I'm special in the way that I said was bad to do here? You can see I didn't have the proper answers to write something like that yet. Maybe future Prof will make that one. Maybe I'll look into the desire for things we know are unhealthy. There's a lot of places that the future can go, but only one the present can be. And so I have to say a goodbye to the Scott Pilgrim franchise for a moment. For now, it will just rest in my mind as the super enjoyable show that I'll incessantly quote for a couple months, and probably would think back on later with a clearer head to great effect. Plus, it's doing weird things to my life, like literally after rewatching it, the original movie, my own evil ex showed back up in town. I'm not sure what will happen if I keep watching more Scott, or keep engaging with more Scott Pilgrim media, so I think I have to call it quits for now.